I certainly noticed that during the last election we had the contrast between strengthen our borders and I think it was protect our borders or some ridiculous distinguishing factor. What do you guys think the solution is to, I suppose, this what I would call the soundbite debate on asylum seekers is?
I guess I'd repeat what I just said. Yeah. The problem is that we've got a decade or so of Howard's rather poisonous, very skillful poisonous contribution, where, for example, even now, just yesterday, I think Scott Morrison referred to illegals. You know, that was one of the most skillful bits of public rhetoric available, because it carries the suggestion that they've broken the law, and as soon as they've broken the law, locking them up looks all right. And if you lock them up and they then riot, well, of course they need to be locked up. You know, it's just astonishing. Now, I don't know how you flush that out of the system. First of all, you've got to want to, and I don't see any will on either side of Parliament to get rid of that sort of cheap populist rhetoric.
I have a friend at the Refugee Studies Centre in Oxford who's actually a Monash graduate in political science, so he's Aussie, loves Aussie football, getting his son to eat Vegemite. But he just says, you Aussies love asylum seekers, meaning we actually hate them, but we love talking. We as a country are far more obsessed with asylum seekers than any country in the world, honestly. And I think if you haven't seen that excellent recent SBS series about Australia and multiculturalism and so forth, watch it, watch the whole thing, and just try and understand how our policies have developed historically. And that's what we've got to counter. A glimmer of hope is the fact that multiculturalism as a word has come up on the agenda again. And asylum seekers, although we have this, you know, strictly speaking, separate legal system, they're a separate category, which kind of means that they're shooting themselves in the foot by claiming to be refugees quite often. We really do need to push this idea that we are a multicultural and accepting society.
I'm just going to say a couple of things about it. I think it's actually a huge question, which we don't have full time to deal with, but we do have this 3-year political cycle, 24-hour news cycle, 7-second grab, that's reducing the capacity to focus on and sustain focus on particular issues, and asylum seekers is one of them. I think it's very turnaroundable, but it does require leadership. And leadership, we often think of it in terms of, you know, the political philosophy that people have or how competent they are as politicians, but there are other qualities like, well, just to name one, curiosity, another one would be diligence, things like that we should be valuing in people who are leaders. When the Kosovo refugees were here a little over 10 years ago, there was in fact immense community support. And that was before Tampa and so on. It's there and it can be tapped into. I mean, there are various projects like the Key of Sea that are working towards, I guess, the wider community in relation to that. But if our political debate is talkback, we're in real trouble.
Can I just add, as someone who has to participate in the 7-second public grabs, I think it is a real problem, but I think that there's two things that I think you've alluded to that are really important. One is that when you think about, when you talk about it in the context of asylum seekers, there's a certain frame, but actually most people in Australia would have a really positive story to tell about someone they work with, someone who's married to someone that they know, someone who lives in their street, who has come here as a refugee. And there's always this disjuncture between the individual people they know who are okay and this general feeling. And I think that we don't talk enough about we don't fan the positive aspects that exist in Australian society enough. We fan the negative ones. And so one thing that I try and do every time I can is to remind people of the stories that they all no doubt have close to home that counter that negative one. And I guess secondly, that's why during my talk I placed emphasis on going back to basics and talking about those universal principles again. I mean, part of the reason that we have separate legal categories and we have treatment of people with less rights than others is it's a dehumanising process. It's a process of trying to make people seem different. And we've had this we've had 20, 30 years of segmenting people into different categories. And I think the more, it's hard to do in 7-second grab, but people do actually respect the idea that we are all human and that there is something universal about that. And so I think the more, it's a long process, but the more we can fan that universality in the face of two other major political parties who actually don't have guiding principles like that anymore, the better.
I agree with that. Can I add one thing? That's why I distinguish between racism and xenophobia. If they're married to your sister, or if you've worked with them at the factory, they're not other. They may come from a different country, but they're not other. They're part of us. If they're the previous wave of refugees who've got nice restaurants that you enjoy going to, they're not other. They're one of us. Actually, I think one of the best ways to get Afghan and Iraqi refugees accepted a bit better is to start up some Afghan, but you'll have to improve their food a bit. Sorry to my Afghan friends.
Yeah, so I think over the last few days, with the events on Christmas Island and around Australia as well, we've seen really the barbarity of Australia's asylum policy, not only in terms of the brutality of the imprisonment, but also in terms of obviously the brutal repression that was meted out by the police force using beanbag shots and tear gas. And look, on my part, I think the refugees locked up are actually right to resist their imprisonment. I think that they're right to fight back and struggle for their human rights. But I was wondering, my question really is what you think young progressive people or progressive students should do on our side of the fence, in terms of how we can actually stand with the refugees, in their struggle for their rights. Because I think, over the past few years, there have been small victories. We saw last year the High Court decision that it was unconstitutional, to maintain offshore processing. But these victories have been coupled with defeats as well. Obviously, notoriously, the decision in Al-Kateb and other decisions. But also, I think fundamentally, there's been nothing that's challenged the sort of political hegemony of the idea of mandatory detention. And so, while I think legal advocacy is important, I think it also needs to be coupled with a political campaign, involving students, involving ordinary people from the ground up, that actually challenges that idea of mandatory detention and that pushes the Labor Party, away from this sort of capitulation to the Liberal Party's racist rhetoric. So I was just wondering what you think about that.
Speaking for myself, I agree completely. I don't think it's a legal campaign at all. There are very few legal points that haven't been tested. I think it is almost wholly a political campaign, and the real trick is how to engage the public and change their view. I thought that we had achieved that position when Evans announced the new philosophy in July 2008. But then everything changed. And the trouble is, once you've got someone like Abbott who's going to set the tone, then it is a race to the bottom, unless you have leadership. And that's why I suspect that it's the crossbenchers who now are in a position to try and reframe the debate and readdress what the public perceive wrongly about asylum seekers.
Yes, I absolutely agree with Julian, but you can also do your own bit in your own small way just by talking to people and trying to persuade people in your family. I've found amongst my circle of friends that 10 years ago I broke up dinner parties, but now people actually ask me what my views are on asylum seeker issues. So attitudes are changing, but perhaps still not with the right people. But there's also a problem, I think, with the ownership of newspapers in this country too. So, we've got a very dichotomised debate. So I'm all for more online stuff, and I think you young people actually you've got it there. You can. I think it's just amazing. As Adam was talking about revolutions and how ideals have been founded on revolutions, I was just thinking, hey, we've got a few revolutions going on at the moment in the world, actually, and a lot of those have come about through new technology. It's just amazing. So I think go to it. I think.
Can I add one other response? I thought the breakouts and riots on Christmas Island, although understandable, were really regrettable. I think it sets back the cause a long way. And whatever public campaigning techniques you adopt, there's no way to put this and make it not sound stupid, but try and keep it polite. Anything that looks like 1960s hairy radicalism is not going to win the hearts and minds of the people we need to persuade. It just isn't.
I mean, I think there are many dimensions to the question. I just want to add one thing. In relation to the violence at Christmas Island, the police have engaged in violence, as Julian's told us, but there is no oversight of that. They're investigating themselves and appear to have found themselves not guilty of doing anything wrong, as you would expect. Now, those kind of systems underlie so many things that are happening in relation to this, and I think it's quite important that we hold on to this principle and keep focusing this principle of accountability in relation to the use of power.